What's all that dang blab noise going on out there, deputies? Don't y'all know we're trying to conduct an investigation in here? Eric heard the Virginia drawl, but couldn't see where the commanding voice was coming from. Ah, sorry, sir, one of the officers subduing Eric replied. This son bitch wouldn't move on. He blocked the road then tried to rush the house. Eric tried turning his head to see the figure that went with the voice, but only succeeded in getting a mouthful of dirt. I don't like that language, Deputy Gaines. You will apologize to that man for your words. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Don't apologize to me, Deputy. Apologize to that man y'all sitting on now. Now y'all haul him up here and we'll see what he's got to say. And son, the voice added for Eric's benefit, you better have a right good reason for evading my crime scene. Strong arms roughly pulled Eric to his feet, and a steely-eyed deputy looked Eric in the eye and muttered, Sorry, you son bitch. Then they unceremoniously marched Eric up to the house. What the fuck's going on? Let me go. I didn't do anything. My name is Eric Murphy. I'm trying to find my brother Sean Murphy. I think this is his house. Let me go, goddammit. Eric struggled in vain. They just wrenched his arms tighter behind his back, almost lifting him off the ground by the handcuffs. Boy, you shut your mouth right now. You heard the sheriff. He don't much take a liking to that kind of language. Now hush up or we're gonna be forced to teach you some manners, southern style. You understand? Eric grunted as the pain burned in his shoulders. They led him under the front porch through the low door into the basement and dumped him roughly in the corner. Eric squirmed around into a sitting position against the cool stone wall and tried to regain his breath. Two of the deputies stood over him while he heard the third clomping heavily up the stairs. Eric looked up at the two men, who stood looking neutrally down at him with no expression on their faces. He heard the third man telling someone upstairs, the man from outside he assumed, that they had him in the basement, and did he want him brought upstairs? No, I'm sure he'll keep, the voice from outside answered. Y'all go on back to what you were doing and tell that boy I will be down to see him directly. Get his car into the drive before someone hits it and we got an even bigger mess on our hands. Eric heard him plainly, but the deputies repeated it to him when they came back down. Then the trio left him with a warning on not trying to run off and went back outside, leaving him alone. Eric looked around, taking in his surroundings. There was plenty of light from a window next to the door. He found himself in a low room with a brick floor, stone wall, and heavy, solid-looking, hand-hewn beams overhead. The house was old, he could tell from just what he could see here, but it was solid as a fort. Boy, they sure don't build them like this anymore, he thought absently. Heavy footsteps above him drew his attention. He tried to follow the steps. He thought he could make out 3 or 4 different people moving around above him. He could hear them talking, but could only make out an occasional word or phrase. What could have possibly happened, he wondered. He hoped it was all some sort of mistake, that he'd been wrong, and that wasn't Sean's wagoneer outside, and this wasn't Sean's house. He ran scenario after scenario through his head. Nothing made sense. Was Sean okay? Did he hurt someone? Was he hurt? Eric kept telling himself everything would be okay. Think positive, and drive on like Sean always told him, but his resolve was crumbling. He felt deep-seated dread in the pit of his stomach. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew it wasn't good. More footsteps drew his attention, this time coming down the steps. After a moment, 3 men came around the corner. One in the now familiar deputy sheriff's uniform, and 2 men in suits. One, the taller of the two, had a frazzled, unkempt look in a cheap store-bought brown suit. The other man, smaller, almost dapper, in a light gray-tailored, obviously expensive suit. But it was his face that drew Eric's attention. His eyes, his look, his manner, all spoke of confidence and demanded attention. He was in command. Without uttering a word, Eric knew he was the man that belonged to the voice he had heard earlier. Brown suit had soft gray eyes, but they darted everywhere. Eric surmised the man wasn't as dumb as he looked. He produced a small tape recorder, turned it on, and set it in front of Eric. Then he flipped open a notebook, produced a pen seemingly out of thin air, and gave the other man a nod. For the record, the smaller man began, let me state that it is Good Friday, April 6, 1993. He paused and checked his watch closely. 3:36 p.m. I am Sheriff R.A. Colton, Assisting me is Detective Alan Peartree and Deputy Peter Hall. He then turned his attention to Eric for the first time, and Eric was somewhat stunned by the intensity of the man's pale blue eyes. Now, son, he began, giving Eric a stern fatherly look. Why don't you tell us who you are and why you disobeyed my deputies and invaded my crime scene? Eric stumbled at first, not thinking straight. My name is Eric Murphy, and I want to speak to my brother, Sean Murphy. I think this is his house. I don't know, but I demand you uncuff me and let me speak to my brother. Eric finished, trying to hold the sheriff's gaze with a defiant look of his own. The corners of the sheriff's mouth tightened, and he squatted down in front of Eric and shut off the recorder. He looked sadly at Eric, then spoke slowly without taking his eyes off him. Deputy Hall, have the boys search this man's car and see if you can ascertain it is indeed his. The deputy left without a word, leaving Eric alone with the two men. The sheriff smiled at Eric. Then in one lightning-fast move, he slapped Eric hard across the face, catching Eric completely by surprise, stunning him. You son of a bitch! Eric spat, tasting blood in his mouth. The sheriff smiled and slapped him again, this time the other way. I think if you remember, son, you heard me say earlier I do not tolerate language like that. You may even remember I made the deputy apologize to you. You remember that? He arched his eyebrows to emphasize his question as he looked intently at Eric. Eric tried again to hold his gaze, but finally lowered his eyes and mumbled, Yeah, I remember. The sheriff nodded, smiling. And, he probed. Eric worked his jaw back and forth a couple times, still tasting blood and feeling it trickle down the side of his mouth. Okay, I'm sorry, he said, looking at the sheriff again, with anger and humiliation in his eyes. I'd watch myself if I were you, son. That's a dangerous look you're giving me right now. What you gotta understand is that first slap was to get your attention. I do not think I had that before. Now, I do. The second was only because you chose to offend me with your cursing. I am still trying to keep this a friendly interview. Do you understand? You will not make demands, you will not threaten myself or my staff, and you will most definitely watch your language in my presence. He smiled again at Eric, this time reassuringly. Have I made myself clear? He asked, rising to his feet. Eric nodded slowly that he understood. Good, the sheriff said. Now let's start over, and I will say that I'm sorry for not making myself understood correctly from the beginning. He bent down and pushed the record button again. You say your name is Eric Murphy? Yes. And your address and social security number? I live at the Other Side Motel on Route 18 in North Jackson, Ohio, apartment number 6. My social security number is 070905555. And what brings you to our fair county at this time? I came to visit my brother who moved down here a month or so ago. Eric sat with his eyes closed, trying to hold his tongue and answer these stupid questions in a neutral voice. His mind was screaming, What's going on? Where's Sean? But he forced himself to play the sheriff's game. That's good. See how easy all this is? May I call you Eric? The sheriff asked in a gentle, soothing voice, designed to put his suspects at ease. Yeah, sure, Eric shrugged. Good. Now, Eric, you said you think your brother lives here. Don't you know his address? No, not the number anyway, Eric answered haltingly. He had described the house, and I was following his directions, and that's his Jeep in the drive, I believe. They were interrupted by the return of Deputy Hall, who brought Eric's registration in. The sheriff nodded with satisfaction. Now, Eric, do you have any identification to prove you are who you say you are? Yeah, in my wallet, Eric said, indicating his right hip with a nod of his head. The sheriff motioned to Deputy Hall and nodded. He moved forward and uncuffed Eric. Eric sighed with pleasure and shook his hands, trying to restore the feeling in them. Better? The sheriff asked, arching his eyebrows. Yeah, thanks a lot, Eric said, rubbing his raw wrists. Then he reached into his pants and pulled out his wallet and held it out for the sheriff, who declined it, asking, Could you remove your driver's license, please? Eric shrugged. Suit yourself, he said, removing the small plastic card and handing it to the sheriff. The sheriff took it and squinted, holding the card at arm's length to read it. Yup, he said, comparing Eric's face to the picture. Looks like you are who you say you are. He handed the license back to Eric, who put it away. Where's my brother? He asked in an undemanding tone. Is this his house? He asked pleadingly. The sheriff nodded. Yes, I'm afraid it is from what we can tell. But your brother, I'm not sure about yet. Eric got a confused look on his face and started to speak, but the sheriff held up his hand, stopping him before he started. Now what you got to understand is we only got here a little afore you did. These things take time, especially things of this magnitude. Now you want to help, don't you? He spoke with the quiet passion of a con man. Eric wanted to do all he could to help, just from the tone of his voice. Good. The sheriff smiled while Eric nodded yes. Now you answer all Detective Petrie's questions, and maybe you can help us out in just a little bit, okay? Eric said that was fine, anything he could do. The sheriff nodded to the still silent detective, turning the show over to him, and turned and left the room. A moment later, Eric heard him on the steps going back upstairs. All right, Mr. Murphy, the detective said in a surprisingly mild voice for a man of his size. For what reason are you in the area? He asked in a neutral tone. Eric felt anger rising, but held it in check. He tried to keep his features calm as well. I was coming to visit my brother for Easter. The detective commented as he scribbled notes. Eric noticed the tape was still running. How would you describe your relationship with your brother? Great. I mean, we'd had some rough times, and we had our differences, but we had worked it all out. He's the greatest person I know. Where is he anyway? Is something wrong? Is he hurt? Eric asked, his curiosity and the feeling that something was terribly wrong getting the best of him. The detective ignored the questions and kept scribbling in his notebook. After a few moments, he looked at Eric with the same neutral expression and resumed his questions. Was your brother involved in the sale or distribution of controlled substances, or did he use said controlled substances? The detective's tone remained neutral, but the sixth sense that something was wrong was screaming inside Eric's head. Then it hit him, and that uneasiness in the pit of his stomach turned into a balloon that swelled inside him until he couldn't breathe. Mr. Murphy, the detective prompted. Eric felt the color drain from his face and struggled to speak. You said was, like in past tense. Was your brother involved? Did something happen to Sean? Tell me right now, goddammit. Eric felt close to panic. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. He was wrong. He was wrong. His mind kept repeating over and over. Realizing his mistake, the detective worked his mouth again, trying to think of something to say, but all he could manage was, Heavy footsteps sounded on the steps, and the sheriff's voice boomed. Mr. Murphy, what did I tell you about that language? He came around the corner, fury etched on his features. This time, Eric met his gaze and matched the look in his eye. He said was, Eric exploded, finally venting his anger. He said was my brother, or did he use? Why is he speaking in the past tense? Where's Sean? Eric's intensity stopped the sheriff in his tracks. He held Eric's gaze for a moment, then his features softened. He raised his hand and put it on Eric's shoulder and soothed. Now calm down, son. I was gonna wait, but I guess there's no time like the present. Son, your brother Sean was killed sometime early this morning by a person or persons yet unknown. The sheriff said it with as much compassion as possible, but it didn't lessen the sting. The familiar empty pain that accompanies the death of a loved one quickly replaced the panic Eric had felt. He began shaking his head and saying, No, over and over. It can't be possible, he blurted, but inside he knew. Sean can't be dead. He was a SEAL for almost 20 years, in and out of combat since Vietnam. No, he can't be. But even as he heard himself saying the words, Eric knew the pain wasn't wrong. He felt Sean's life force absent, and there was only the pain and the emptiness that follows it filling him. But he still kept saying no, as the tears fell unashamedly down his cheeks. It's all right, son. It's all right. Petrie, find a chair or stool or something. Come on now, boy. Sit here. He guided Eric to an old chair the detective had hastily brought from the next room. Eric gratefully sat down and buried his face in his hands and cried. Feeling a little embarrassed, the detective and the sheriff excused themselves and told Eric they'd continue in a little while and give him a few minutes alone. Eric hardly heard them. His mind was numb. He'd just spoken with his brother, and this visit was important to them both. After feeling alone and being lost for so long, he and Sean had bonded so deeply these last few months. Right now, he couldn't imagine going on without his brother's support. Now, everyone was gone but him. Mom, Dad, and now Sean. Now he really was all alone, and the enormity of it threatened to crush him. What will I do now? He thought. Oh, God help me. Then a different feeling struck. A moment before he had felt his resolve and newly found confidence crumbling. Now he felt a surge of both, and he thought of Sean's words. Drive on, no matter what. Drive on and never quit. He wiped the tears away, feeling slightly ashamed. What would Sean do? He asked himself. He wouldn't sit here crying, feeling sorry for himself. Maybe later when he was alone, but not now with things to do. Eric wiped his face again, almost hearing Sean's voice repeat the words in his head. He took a deep breath and wandered out into the afternoon sun. The rays warmed his face, and the cool breeze cleared his head. He turned around and took a long look at the house. The stone foundation, the columns of the front porch, the chimneys rising at either end surrounded by scaffolding, the new vinyl siding. No wonder Sean had been so excited. This place had grace, a relaxed repose. Sean could have done a lot worse, especially for the money he had spent. God, it was hard to think of Sean in the past tense. Maybe there was some mistake, but he knew better. There you are, a voice boomed, startling him. Eric turned to see the sheriff and Detective Petrie coming out from under the front porch, having followed him through the door there. The sheriff followed his gaze. Nice house, he commented. Your brother sure did an awful lot of work on her in such a short time. Place used to look like it was about ready to fall down. Never did understand why they used to put up the front porch and main entrance so high, then put a door to the basement underneath. They all gazed at the house. Almost like a modern-day split level, Eric observed. The sheriff nodded. I think they did it to make 'em look grander. Look at the way those stairs come down. Makes it look stately, and they was really big on that way back when this place was built, the sheriff said, still looking up at the house rising in front of them. Eric looked away and took a hard look at the sheriff. There's something you had in mind, Sheriff? Or do you want me to stand here and discuss the finer points of Southern architecture? Eric asked in a conversational tone. Well, yes, sir. There is something at that. Now, son, we can do it one of two ways. We need you to identify the body. We can go up there and do it, or we can wait until the coroner gets him and cleans things up and do it at the morgue. The sheriff stated flatly, gazing respectfully but steadily at Eric. We can do it now, Eric responded, with courage he didn't feel, his throat tightening. Are you sure, son? I gotta tell you, it ain't pretty what happened. The sheriff explained sympathetically. Eric squared his shoulders and shook his head. No, let's get it done. It's the way he'd want it, Eric said, thinking how Sean would have handled this. Suit yourself, the sheriff replied. Then, taking a deep breath, he guided Eric back into the house. The sheriff led the way with Eric in the middle, and Detective Petrie bringing up the rear. Did you know any women in your brother's life at this time? He asked, arching his eyebrows. Yeah, Eric said at once. Abby somebody. I don't remember the last name. Why, did she do it? Eric questioned. Abby Deacon according to the ID, the sheriff answered, ignoring Eric's question for a moment, and led Eric around the corner into the foyer. And no, I don't think she did it, he added as Eric stepped into the foyer. The stench was what hit Eric first. The sickening, sweet smell of death, the coppery smell of blood, and the odor of feces added in for good measure. Eric saw the body lying in the middle of the foyer, back a ways from the front door. Blood and tissue were spattered on the walls behind, as well as to the side of her, and she lay in a pool of gooey-looking, coagulating blood. It would be impossible to tell her identity from her face. Most of it and her shoulder were gone. Looked like she was answering the door when it happened, the sheriff indicated neutrally. The front door had a section of it, and the door jamb blasted away, leaving a gaping hole where you could clearly see outside. Blood was everywhere. They had to be careful not to step in it. Eric felt bile rising in his throat and fought the urge to vomit. This way, the sheriff said, urging Eric up the stairs to the second floor where another body was lying in the hall. At the rear of the house, a photographer was just finishing up a series of photos. "Just about done, Chief," he said, seeing the sheriff. Eric saw the body and staggered. "Easy now," Detective Petrie said, steadying Eric so he didn't faint. The urge to vomit was almost as overpowering as was the stench up there in the confined hall. "He took what looks like a shotgun blast full in the face and upper torso, just like the woman downstairs, only he didn't have a door in the way to absorb some of the blast," the sheriff narrated, staring down at the body, trying to visualize the scene. Eric turned away and retched, bile filling his mouth, but he gulped it down and took a deep breath, trying to fill his lungs with clean air. "I know there ain't much left of his face, son, but what do you think? Is that your brother?" Eric steeled himself and turned for another look. He wanted to say no, to find something that would make this not Sean, but the longer he looked, the more he knew it was. When Eric spoke, his voice was shaky. "I'm not sure, but the size, build, and hair color look right from what I can tell." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to make the image of Sean's body go away. "Any scars or identifying marks on his body you know of?" Detective Petrie asked. Eric laughed at the question despite the circumstance. "Yeah, all over his body. He was wounded half a dozen times between Nam and Central America. I can't tell you any in particular, though." "Wait a minute," Eric said as a thought flashed in his mind. "His Achilles," he said, looking at the sheriff, then at the detective. "He tore his Achilles tendon last year. He has a big, ugly scar down the back of his leg here." Eric lifted his own foot, indicating where the scar was by running his hand down his own heel. The sheriff nodded to Detective Petrie, who moved forward and lifted the body's right pant leg. Since the body was on its left side and had no socks, the long, ugly scar was easily visible. Eric turned away, a single tear running down his cheek. The sheriff nodded to Petrie, who pulled the pant leg back down. "Well, that seals it," the sheriff stated, exhaling loudly. "Sorry, Mr. Murphy. I wish there was some mistake, but do you agree that's your brother, Sean Murphy?" Eric just nodded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Murphy. Please speak up so I can get your answer on tape," the sheriff urged. Eric sighed heavily. "Yes, that's my brother Sean Murphy," he said too loudly and wiped his eyes on the back of his shirt. "Thank you, Mr. Murphy. That's all for now, but we'll have some more later." "Where are you staying?" the detective asked. Eric stopped in his tracks. "I don't know. I was gonna stay here," he shrugged. "That won't be possible right now, sir," the sheriff intoned professionally. "You're telling me? Listen, you couldn't pay me to stay here right now. Know what I mean?" Eric resounded, looking around. We see your point," the sheriff answered. "Mr. Murphy, we'll help you find a hotel and make arrangements. If you need, is there anyone else to notify? Any other family?" Eric shook his head. "No, just me, and maybe some of his old Navy buddies. He just retired from the Navy a few months back." The sheriff took a notepad from his coat and scribbled in it for a minute. "Here's directions to a nice little hotel in Warrenton, the number of a good funeral home, and the number to our office. Let Detective Petrie know your whereabouts, please. We'll need to ask you more questions later. Now, if you'll excuse me, we gotta get to work on this case. I don't mind telling you this has me riled up. Fauquier County is a nice, peaceful place. I don't want this kind of thing getting too regular." Eric moved as if in a daze. He went downstairs and out the basement door, avoiding even looking at the dead woman in the foyer. Once outside, he took several deep breaths, trying to clear the stench from his lungs and mind. He walked aimlessly to his car, not sure of his next move. The coroner's van had arrived, and he saw them removing gurneys and taking them into the house. As he watched, a shiny new Cadillac nosed through the cordon into the drive. It passed Eric and drove up close to the house. "I should stay with Sean," he thought. Then he thought, what would that accomplish? A shower. He wanted a shower to try and wash the stench off. He got into his car and put his registration back in the glove box. Christ, he didn't even remember them giving it back to him. He looked at the house one last time, barely noticing the two large figures that had emerged from the Cadillac. Two broad-shouldered, narrow-hipped, immaculately dressed men with military-style haircuts were easing their way up the steps of the front porch. Eric turned his ignition, hardly noticing the engine growl to life. No thrills now. His mind was elsewhere.